What's up, Breakthrough Success listeners? Mark Bird, the podcasting coach here, helping people launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts. And one of the things that has really fascinated me with doing all these interviews, with seeing successful people in all different fields, is that you often see successful people get super overwhelmed with their work. And you see people who they're making a ton of money, but they don't really feel fulfilled. So in this episode, we're going to talk about why exactly do successful people burnout, and how can we avoid that fate for ourselves. The guest who joins us today, he is an orthopedic complex spinal deformity surgeon who was based in Seattle. He left that position in 2018 after 32 years in practice. Today, his mission is to reintroduce true healing into medicine. Our guest feels that doctors should be given the time to listen and understand their patients. And he's got a lot of advice that he's going to share on how he can avoid the burnout and really define what success is for each and every one of us. So our guest who joins us for this episode of Breakthrough Success is none other than David Hanscom. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on the show.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on Breakthrough Success. And I mean, you've been in the field for 32 years. You've seen people who have been overworked, who have been burnt out. And I'm wondering, what do you believe really leads to the burnout that really affects so many people?
It's anxiety. It's suppressed anxiety. And here's my story. So by every stretch of imagination, I was incredibly successful. And I give lectures around the country about what's success. And what happens right now, I did it. I came from an abusive family background. At age 15 years old, I literally shut the door on my past. I became smart, intelligent, academically gifted. I went to top medical school programs, residencies, and fellowship. The spine fellowship that I went to is considered in the top 3 in the world at the time. I practiced complex spinal deformity surgery for 32 years. I was Seattle's senior spine surgeon for many of those years. So I actually was successful, right? Sounds pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay. So in 1990, I was driving across the Lake Washington Bridge about 10 o'clock at night. I went from being a fearless spine surgeon, and I use the word fearless in all capital letters. My attitude was bring it on. I can take on anything. There's actually one of my identities was being absolutely fearless. I went from being a fearless spine surgeon to crippling panic attacks in one day. One day. That makes no sense, right? And what happened for the next 15 years, I developed severe chronic pain, crippling anxiety. I developed a full-blown obsessive compulsive disorder. In 2002, I was actively suicidal. I have 19 medical school colleagues, including my best friend who's a spine surgeon, 4 medical school classmates who are dead from suicide. The burnout rate in medicine right now is around 50 to 70%. And so people are making more money, they're working longer hours, and they're burning out. I'm just perspective. I'm not sure exactly where you're at in your career, but is that success? Doesn't really sound like it, right?
Right. I mean, all the hours. I mean, what are you going home to?
Right. So I'm curious from your perspective. Okay, here I am. I top spine fellowship, high level practice, plenty of money, beautiful house on the golf course. I did lose a marriage in the midst of all this. I had 1 child. I was married for 22 years with my first wife. And around once that panic attack hit 1990, it was just, life disappeared. I went through a 15-year burnout. I was very fortunate to make it through. That's how the book evolved, by the way, this Back in Control, a surgeon's roadmap out of chronic pain. And I went through chronic pain myself for 15 solid years. I came out of it by accident. In the last 10 years, neuroscience research explains exactly what the problem is and how to solve it. The reason why I find quit medicine, I'll just segue here just for a second, is that I was watching hundreds of patients go to pain-free with minimal risk, essentially no cost, self-directed process. I was watching 3 to 5 patients every week come into my practice with major surgeries being done or recommended on normal spines. And I saw a 32-year-old kid about 2 years ago that was paralyzed by an operation that he didn't need. And I just said, I'm done. can't do this anymore. There's actually a form of burnout in medicine right now. They're calling it a moral injury, is that the business of medicine has taken time away from us to talk to our patients. We can't talk to our patients because we're in a production mode. And what's ironic is that the number one thing that probably prevents burnout is talking to the patients. What the patients need is to actually have the physicians talk to them, listen to them. We all know in any endeavor, you can't really solve the problem until you actually can understand the problem. And understanding your patient is a very complex problem. So what we do in medicine is actually mind-numbing repetition. There's medications, physical therapy, surgery. What makes medicine incredibly interesting is actually talking to the patients. So we catch-22 here is that we're on an assembly line. We're not talking to our patients. Our patients are frustrated. We're frustrated. We already have a huge workload. And the bottom line is, it's all leading to about a 50 to 70% burnout rate. In neurosurgery, by the way, the burnout rate is 65%. So going back to your question from your perspective, it still seems like I was, quote, successful, right? Why did I almost kill myself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really deep question right there. I mean, it's all about how you measure success, and a lot of people measure it by money. But again, like, what are you coming home to? What's life outside of the work? And I mean, it's really fascinating when you think of it that way. And you mentioned how you were in this burnout rut for 15 years. People get out of it at different times. Some people get out much faster. Some people stay in that burnout phase for the rest of their life. But you were able to get out. And you mentioned it happened by accident, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on how you were able to get out of that burnout phase and back into a productive mode, positive outlook on life.
So first of all, I did go solo and actually started to commit suicide. I actually started the act, and that's a bad sign. As you know, when you actually have a plan and start to execute it, that's a big plan. And what causes burnout, and doctors will not mention this, neither will high-level professionals, is I was a master at suppressing anxiety. What caused me to almost call it a day was that unrelenting anxiety. I could not deal with it anymore. And I would get these thoughts. I was racing thoughts all the time. I couldn't sleep. In medicine, we tend to be perfectionist, which means you're never going to be happy with yourself. So you have no place to go that's peaceful. And so what happened is that there's research done on what's called expressive writing. It's simply write down your thoughts, you tear them up. And what we find out is that thoughts, emotional pain, and physical pain go to the same part of the brain. They're processed in a similar manner. You have a similar stress response, which is elevated adrenaline, cortisol, and histamines. And when you have these unpleasant thoughts, the research term is called URTs, or unpleasant repetitive thoughts. Every human being has thoughts that they can't escape from. So a physical threat is solved usually by escaping the threat. Humans have a problem compared to other animals that we can't escape our thoughts. And so what happens, all of us are subjected to a certain number of unpleasant thoughts. It's processed the same way as a physical threat, but we can't escape it. What this writing exercise did, within 2 weeks after I started these writing exercises, and again, I had no idea back then what those meant. After 15 solid years of unrelenting anxiety, multiple physical symptoms, all of a sudden things started to shift. Within 6 weeks, things had shifted dramatically, and by 6 months, I was fine. So it all started with what's called expressive writing. The research on it started back in 1982 with Dr. James Pennybaker out of Austin, Texas. There's over 1,000 research papers that documents what's called expressive writing, starts breaking this cycle. And they're just obsessive thought patterns where you have these spinning circuits. They're like little dust devils. They're not rational. You can't control them. And somehow the writing, I call it mechanical meditation, somehow the writing separates you from those thoughts. And things start to shift. I'm convinced with chronic pain that the essence of chronic pain is actually the mental pain. If I give a patient a choice of getting rid of their physical pain or getting rid of their mental pain, almost everybody wants to get rid of their mental pain. Unrelenting anxiety is just brutal. That's what drove me down the hole. That's what I think causes burnout. And the reason why I became a fearless surgeon in spite of anxiety is that I was a master at suppressing it. I mean, I actually did not know what anxiety was until I went from no anxiety to a panic attack in one day. And I was fearless. I mean, I was absolutely fearless. One day I went from being fearless to being crippled by anxiety. I did not come out of the hole for another 15 years. It also turns out that anxiety is not psychological. So I'm guessing that you're taught that anxiety is psychological, right? Right? No?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
Okay, but I mean, if you feel anxious, you feel sort of bad about yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the crux. If we can talk about burnout, which I can talk about a little bit more, but the solution is different than you would think. So the essence of my burnout was suppressed anxiety. And as you well know, that you can't escape your thoughts. When you try not to think about something, you think about it more. This is documented very nicely in a 1987 Harvard experiment called White Bears. We try not to think about the white bears. Not only do you think about them more, you think about them a lot more. So we know thought suppression actually doesn't work. Right? Thought suppression is probably the basis of a lot of mental health issues. So as a master at suppressing thoughts, so remember, mental threats go to the same part of the brain as physical threat. Emotional pain is felt the same way as physical pain is. Since you can't escape your thoughts, levels of adrenaline, cortisol, and histamines. When you're full of these stress chemicals, the sensation generated is simply anxiety. Anxiety is not a diagnosis, it's just a description of elevated stress chemicals. Just like you're lying on the beach full of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, the good drugs, you feel relaxed. But you wouldn't call relaxed a diagnosis, right? So anxiety is also not a diagnosis either. The reason why this is so critical is that this unconscious survival response is present in every living creature. Humans call it anxiety. The unconscious brain processes 11 million bits of information per second. 11 million. Just so you can guess how much the conscious brain processes.
Very little.
40.
Oh,
40.
All right.
Yeah, so very little. So it's 11 million per second compared to 40 per second. Anxiety is what you have to survive, is not who you are. Who you are as a person is your conscious brain. Now, I wrote a website post called Anxiety, Your Bodyguard or Prison Guard. If you understand that anxiety simply keeps you alive, it says danger. It allows you to navigate the landscape and stay alive. That's what you have. It's an amoral stress chemical response where the conscious brain is who you are. So the first step is to separate who you are, your identity, from this anxiety response. So if you look at anxiety as what you have to survive, it's your bodyguard. If your identity starts getting mixed up with the survival response, it's a prison guard. Because most of what we do in life is limited by our anxiety. So the first thing that people do, and this has been really powerful for me personally, also for people I work with, is just visualize a large thermometer on the other side of the wall and get rid of the word anxiety. When you feel anxious, to say my stress chemicals are elevated, visualize the thermometer going up. The way you decrease anxiety is to decrease the stress chemicals. What doesn't work is talking about it. And remember, it's 11 million to 40. So talking about it using rational means to deal with an unconscious survival response is not going to work. But also remember, the survival response is intended to be so unpleasant that it forces you to take action. Otherwise, you wouldn't survive. The species of creatures who survived are actually the most anxious. It's not really survival of the fittest, it's actually survival of the most anxious. By definition, the creatures that are alive right now are the most anxious ones that have evolved over millions of years. But remember, anxiety is never going to be positive. You can't talk yourself out of it. It's incredibly unpleasant. It will always be that way. The only solution is to use strategies to decrease your stress chemicals. Once you decrease your stress chemicals, the feeling of anxiety drops. It's not primarily a psychological problem.
And that is certainly a very interesting perspective. I mean, like stress and emotions, I mean, they're not just like random things. Like your body is changing based on what emotion you have. And like you're producing more of something or less of something based on what emotion is happening. I mean, I feel like a lot of people know about like dopamine, like when you're happy, that goes up. And similarly, when you're
Right.
stressed and stuff like that, there are different chemicals in your body that are increasing or decreasing. And to be less stressed, I mean, it can come from a chemical standpoint also, not just, like mindset stuff. Like mindset stuff is great. Like think positive and that helps, but there's certainly a lot more to it. And one of the things that David has been mentioning is how he suppressed his anxiety over a long period of time until he really had that one day where it all came out. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that experience, because some people feel like they suppress the anxiety or they feel weak if they express their anxiety. So what's your take on like maybe letting some of it out so you don't have that breakdown day, or just like, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you can't really express it verbally because it's just, again, rational means compared to unconscious patterns. So that's where these writing exercises are so critical. Again, 1,000 research papers, simply writing down your anxiety producing thoughts and tearing them up. So what you've done, you've separated from those thoughts. And so instead of creating this chemical reaction, that's always the first step in solving anxiety are these simple writing exercises. So you write down your thoughts, positive or negative. You instantly tear them up. You tear them up for two reasons. One is to write with freedom. The other one is to not analyze them because your attention's on the thoughts. So all you're trying to do from these thoughts is to separate from them. Just that separation starts decreasing that chemical response. The second thing is, this has been around for hundreds of years, but I wrote a website post called The Ring of Fire. Stress isn't the problem, it's that reaction to the stress. It's that chemical reaction to the stress that's the problem. It's stressful avoiding stress. Your life starts to get smaller. And what you're doing, you're training your brain to have less of a chemical reaction to the stress. So it's called the ring of fire. It's a learned skill. What doesn't work, by the way, is positive thinking, because that's what got me in deep trouble. I was a positive thinker. I'm fearless. I'm this great surgeon. I'm above all this stuff. And so it was positive thinking, which is a global way of suppressing negative thinking. Positive thinking doesn't work at all. What you're training your brain to do is to be okay with anxiety. It's never going to be pleasant. It's a survival feeling. You train your brain to have less of a chemical reaction to that stress, and that stress becomes less of a stress, and you start moving through it. So you don't solve anxiety, you don't solve stress, you learn to move through it. I probably have 5 times the stress on my plate right this second than I had 15 years ago when I broke. I have way more stress on my plate now than when I was suppressing it, and I'm fine. I mean, my wife might argue whether I'm fine or not, but in general, I'm fine. But yeah, no, it's really a learned skill. It's not psychological. You just train your body to have less of a chemical reaction to stress.
And that is a really key point, being able to move through it rather than like try and suppress it.
Right.
Like you can put the effort to like, like minimize it, but it will always be there. So if you're looking
Right.
to like never have an anxious thought, never have a stressful moment, like this isn't the episode for you. You're never going to find an episode like that unless it's clickbait. But I mean, it's really like there is some stress that comes along. There is some fear that comes along that makes you better. And it's just really important to think about that from the chemical reaction standpoint, as David has been sharing. I'm wondering, David, for people who want to learn more about you and follow your work, where are some good places we can go?
I wrote a book called Back in Control, A Surgeon's Roadmap Out of Chronic Pain. And again, anxiety actually is the pain. And then I have a website called backincontrol.com, which is the action plan of the book. The book's just a framework. It's actually learning and improving the tools actually decrease your stress chemical reaction that allows you to thrive. The exciting part for me, and actually what compelled me to quit my practice, is that not only are people going pain-free, when the pain was going away, their anxiety dropped to the floor, but when they weren't battling anxiety, they began to thrive at a level that they never had thrived at before in their entire life. Life became expansive, creative, new jobs, new relationships. I have one daughter of a friend of mine who started work with me, not too long ago. And she started in January. She had anxiety since she was 10. She had chronic pain since she was 15. Within She tried everything for 20 years. Within 6 months after starting the processes that we talked about, she's fine. New job, new careers, pain gone, anxiety down. So it's a very consistent process that happens, and it's not very hard. But the action plan is on backandcontrol.com. It's very self-directed. It starts with those simple writing exercises, and there's a whole sequence over time that starts to work for people.
David, thank you for sharing with us that resource and all of your great insights with us on this episode. It was such a pleasure having you on Breakthrough Success.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.